If I say to a CEO, do you adore your direct reports? 199 are going to say, get out of here. Right? They're going to be insulted by my question. But number 1,000 is going to say, yeah, I do. And when you go to that corporate boardroom, it's going to look very different. And so whether we're talking about parenting, school teaching, managing, it doesn't matter. There's a conventional mindset. It's universal across the earth. There's an unconventional mindset that produces excellence, and it works everywhere, even though everybody knows it can't. If you live in learned helplessness, you know it can't. Everything you experience teaches you that it can't. And if it could, that would be disastrous because you'd have to learn.
Welcome to Return on Empathy, a podcast brought to you by the Empathy Collective, a consulting firm that helps business leaders inspire change, one conversation at a time. We are building a community of like-minded leaders and experts who all share the same passion, taking care of people at work. Whether you are a plant manager trying to humanize the factory floor, a small business owner wanting to build a strong culture that lasts, or a corporate executive striving to prevent burnout in your team, you belong in this community. There's a moment many leaders don't talk about. It happens after the offsite, after the retreat, after the inspiring conversation. It's the moment when you picture yourself walking back into the office, back into meetings, metrics, expectations, and a culture that quietly says, well, that was nice. Now get back to work. Robert Quinn, best-selling leadership author and professor emeritus at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business, has spent decades working with senior leaders. And he's seen this moment again and again. Leaders leave inspired and then they panic, not because they don't care, but because they know the system they're returning to was never designed for deep change. In this second episode of a three-part series on leadership after the breaking point, what crisis reveals and what to do next, we explore what happens when purpose collides with performance and why organizations often reward leaders who solve problems while quietly sidelining those who ask deeper questions about meaning, direction, and humanity. I recently learned that one of my own leadership blind spots is overvaluing purpose, caring deeply about meaning, but not always translating it into outcomes that conventional systems recognize as leadership. That tension isn't just personal, it's structural, and it raises an essential question. Why does purpose feel so threatening inside organizations, especially when so many employees are hungry for it? In this second conversation with Bob, we talk about panic, purpose, collective empathy, and what it really takes to influence change inside conventional cultures. And we ask a question many leaders quietly carry. How do I stay true to what I've seen without being pushed back by the conventional system into who I used to be? This is Return on Empathy. Welcome to the show, Bob. It's so nice to have you here. I was fortunate enough to have you here last week, and now this is the second part of our Leadership Excellence series that we're running right now, and I'm super excited to get into the system conversation because we spent a lot of time last week talking about the twice-born leader and the individual leader and the journey that the individual goes through to leadership excellence. But now let's talk a little bit about how the system impacts that individual leadership excellence. So very excited about the conversation today. Welcome.
Thank you.
One of the things you mentioned last week, and even in one of our previous episodes from last year, I remember you talking about going into work with CEOs, and they leave feeling super inspired. You get to the end of the week and they are pumped. And they're like, all right, let's do this. And then you ask them the question, okay, what are you going to do differently when you get back to the workplace? And then they just kind of freeze and in panic. And you were saying that this is because they're going back to that conventional system, back to the eye rolling, back to the, what do you mean? You want to do a gratitude wall? What's that? They don't want to get laughed at. They want to blend in with everyone else and go back to the status quo. They don't want to sit in that discomfort of being the weird guy who wants to do a gratitude wall with their team. I'm just curious, with all this, seeing this reaction happen all the time with CEOs and with leaders at the end of the week after you work with them, do you ever wonder why am I doing this? Like, well, what's the point?
That is such a great question. Yeah, that is a driving question. That is, if in fact you spend a week, they're totally inspired every single day of the week, and then all of a sudden, when you ask them, "What are you going to do differently?" they panic. One way to react to that is to wash your hands and say, "This is hopeless. These people are so flawed." But that's exactly the wrong stance. The stance that really makes sense is, if they're terrified and very prone not to do anything, the question then is, what's wrong with me? That's not their problem. That's my problem. I'm not an effective teacher. And, personally, in the center of my soul, I'm passionate about transformational teaching, transforming the way people think about their lives and finding the power to thrive in their lives. So if they're afraid and not going to do anything, that's not their problem. That's my problem, right? And that particular problem is something I uh, contemplate every single day. And it crystallizes around a profoundly important question that most people never even think about. And the question is, how do you learn from excellence? And you say, well, that's kind of an esoteric question. It turns out it's at the center of life, but it appears esoteric. That is, the human body is programmed to respond to disruption, to evaluate whether or not it's threat, and the nervous system immediately processes that. We talked about that previously. But what that means is human beings are constantly scanning for threat. Negative is more powerful than positive. Our attention is set to move towards threat, or to get to a more central statement, the problem. What's the problem? Now, the average manager is asking the moment the direct report comes in the room, okay, what's the problem? When you go to publish your book, the publisher says, okay, what problem is the book solving? It's not going to sell unless you're solving a problem. The manager is not effective unless he's solving a problem. And so we live in a problem-solving world, and it's because of biology and culture. They all function as a conspiracy, if you will, a natural conspiracy to focus us on problems. Excellence, by definition, is deviance from the norm. It's not negative deviance, it's positive deviance. We're moving away from the center of the curve. We're doing good things in a way it's normally not done. We say, that's excellent. And so what does it mean to focus on excellence instead of what's wrong? So it's the difference between focusing on the deficit gap and focusing on what do we look like at our very best. Human beings, if you lay out excellence, there's an immunity against that notion. So we're teaching excellence all week long. And in the front part of the week, the resistance we have to deal with is, oh, that's not real. That's not realistic. That can't happen in my company. Let me tell you about my boss. Let me tell you about our industry. And then you just fill in the blank. Every industry fits. So what they're saying is excellence is impossible in my world. In my job, I live in learned helplessness. Excellence is not possible. Furthermore, if it was, that would be terrible, because if excellence were possible, it means I'm not producing it and I would have to change. Now, you can flip that all the way back to where we started this. My natural stance would be to say, these dumb people in this workshop, look at their lack of courage. That is, I can look at all their problems, and then I either quit trying to teach them or I reduce my aspirations. And pretty soon we have a normal workshop doing normal things with normal outcomes. The challenge then is I have to learn. I have to learn how to work with those people in a new way so they can deal with their fears, learn to focus on excellence rather than problem solving, and begin to move towards excellence. That requires me to do things the normal teacher, the normal professor is unwilling to do. And so there's this wonderful question underneath your question that we think is, oh, that's esoteric, when in fact it's at the very center of life. It's the difference between survival. I was recently in a work group where they were sharing their sort of outlook on life. Every person in the group, as they introduced themselves, talked about being driven by the problems in their life, the rivers carrying them down the stream. And they were all saying, I have no sense of purpose. These are very established people. And they're all floating on that river, very busy, being stimulated by problems. But they're not going where they want to go. They're just going someplace. That's a very common condition in life. And so the question is, how do we learn from excellence? If I learn to learn from excellence, I am changing that entire pathway. I'm living an entirely different life. It's a purpose-driven life, and I'm actually moving towards my purpose. And that means I'm living with meaning and deep satisfaction, and I'm contributing to other people.
It sounds wonderful, and I love that picture you painted of moving from the problem-solving survival mode to excellence. How do you get people there? So you were saying, you could easily point the blame on these poor people in the room. Instead, you were turning it on yourself as a teacher. So at that moment, when you look at the panic in their eyes, how do you get them beyond that panic to make real change when they go back to their conventional work environment where all they're asked to do is float downstream and solve problems and react to things?
Yeah. So the conventional answer to that would be, all right, what is the logic here that gets applied to fix this problem? They're not learning. They're afraid. So how do you deal with it? And it goes back to me. And it's not about me having a fixed answer. This is deeply frustrating to people in the conventional mindset. Give me the checklist. When I'm in front of that room and they're not responding, give me the checklist so that I can solve the problem. Well, you're still in the same mindset. I have to stand there. I have to be still. I have to see those people deeply. Now, this gets to the center of your heart, the word empathy. It's not a matter of them being widgets and me being a performer and engaging in the transactional process of educating them, informing them. I have to stand there and feel their fear. I have to be with their fear. And once I am, that is, now I'm not only in a logical relationship with them, I'm also in an emotional relationship with them, which means I'm seeing a reality that most people in the front of the room don't see. Emotion's not part of reality. It's only logical. But in fact, reality, a huge piece of reality, is emotion. In fact, without emotion, there is no logic. So at many levels, the emotion is so crucial. And so I'm feeling the pain. Now the question is, or the temptation is, to tell them the answer. Once again, give them the checklist. When in fact, that's not the place to go. The place to go is to ask the right question. If I ask a question, instead of being an expert, I'm a learner. If it's an authentic, real, genuine question in the moment, in the emotion, I'm now making myself vulnerable. I don't know the answer. I'm just asking the honest question. What I just did is modeled for them a different state of being than the fear state. I'm exercising lots of courage. I'm courageous enough to be vulnerable. Now, if I ask an authentic question that's very centered to where they are emotionally, the question becomes irresistible. They almost always open their hearts and give an incredibly authentic answer. It may be one of frustration and fear, or it may be the beginning of confidence, but it's real. What just happened is we've left normal conversation and we've gone to real conversation, authentic conversation. Now, in authentic conversation, with empathy and respect for them, they're going to respect me. We're going to start trusting each other. We've now created sacred space. In sacred space, the learning is very different. We're not afraid to learn. We can hear each other, listen to each other, we can explore. And so I might say something like, tell me the last time you were at your very best. And because they're in sacred space, they don't have the initial resistance. They tend to actually answer. Well, I do remember, and they'll tell me a story and they'll say, so at your very best, you were feeling this, 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 and this. Now, what would it mean to feel like that more often? Oh, I'd like that. Well, if you went back home on Monday, what could you do that would make you feel like that? Well, I could take that idea we did on Tuesday and now all of a sudden they're in an entirely different life state, right? Because faith has replaced fear. Fear causes the human system to contract. Faith and hope and inspiration and positivity, positive emotions cause the system to open. They begin to see possibilities. And as their fellow traveler, you can continue to ask them questions where they begin to see possibilities. All of a sudden, a transformational moment happens. And in that transformational moment, they are instantaneously empowered. They see something they couldn't see before, and they see the path to get there as well. They can't be stopped. They're going to go home and do it, right? So that's the challenge. And it always begins not with them and their problem, it begins with me. So take it out of an executive workshop. I'm a parent. My kid has this problem that I hate. And I negotiate, no more allowance, no more. And it's not working. The kid's getting worse. Transforming that situation never is going to work by focusing on the kid's problem. It's all about me looking at my failure to influence that kid effectively. The problem's not with the child, the problem's with me. Now, if I care about this kid, do I care enough to change me, to elevate my life state into a different place and create a sacred space with this child? On the rare occasions when we do that with our kids, those are the moments they talk about 60 years later that made a difference to them. And so whether it's being a parent or a spouse or an executive or whatever it is we do in life, that underlying challenge is the same. And most of us don't go there because we just keep solving problems. We don't learn from excellence.
I love that, and, as a parent myself, I really can relate to that. I know you mentioned a couple of examples in your book Lift of some parents and how they tried to struggle with a child and their temper tantrums and things, and it's not until you start asking the right questions and really putting yourself in their shoes until you really understand what's underneath the surface. And I think it's very easy for a parent or a leader to just the behavior, right? You see the behavior and you're like, okay, how do I get rid of this behavior? Rather than asking those deep questions and really understanding why this behavior might be manifesting right now. I actually did this exercise with my son recently. It was probably about 6 or so months ago because he just started kindergarten this year. And shortly after he started, he was struggling. He doesn't normally have tantrums. He's a very calm child, but I could tell he was struggling, and I kept asking him questions. Why? Kind of like he does with me. And I eventually realized, once I got to the fifth why, he said, "Yeah, so mommy, kindergarten is kind of hard, and then once I get to first grade, it'll be even harder, and then when I'm in seventh grade, it'll be really hard." And so the reason for his acting out and his behavior was actually because he was having anxiety about moving up a grade and having different work and different challenges. But, it's you don't know that until you keep asking and really trying to sit with them and be vulnerable yourself, right? As a parent, as a leader, whatever your situation is. So, yeah, I appreciated you sharing that.
Well, that's such a great example you just gave. It's interesting how real that is. The moment you started to describe that, I was a first grader again, because I can remember exactly that same thought process, the same fear. How terrible! How can I go forward into the future? Had that fear, but there you were. You asked why. You asked why. You asked why. That vulnerability is learning. I'm learning in real time how to relate more effectively to my child. Now, that's the opposite of the expert role. And if we go back to childhood again, and we go back to those whys, what most of us experience is we say, why? And then finally, a frustrated mother says to us, because I told you so.
I've been
That
there.
happens all the time. When that moment happens, we're learning our first lessons about authority and hierarchy, right? Because I told you so. We're going to learn that 10,000 times over between talking, 2 years old, and 18 years old. We've internalized the hierarchy long before we go into the professional world, and there it just gets reinforced more. But here's the key. It's all about being the expert. If I'm the mother, then I get to say, I told you so. If I'm the boss, I get to say, because I told you so, right? That's the peak of the hierarchy. That's where we should all be. If I'm really powerful, I'm the boss. I get to say those words. Now, virtually every human being sinks into that trap. We choose control over effectiveness. If I'm telling the kid, because I told you so, at least I'm in control. It may be totally ineffective. If I'm the boss and the organization's falling apart, that doesn't matter. What matters is I'm in control. And your simple story illustrates the alternative. When I ask why, which takes time and energy, I'm a learner. I'm not the expert. And when I'm learning with my child, change becomes possible. You reminded me of a great story. We did a study of the top 1% school teachers. So this was the study of excellence. So they're not like the normal school teacher. And in interviewing one of them, she told a story that was simply breathtaking. She said, my children in my class adore me. Now, that could cause kind of a jolt, right? And then she finished the statement and said, because I adore them. And then she described this incredibly unconventional classroom culture, full of love, full of learning, and it was breathtaking. Now, we heard that from every one of the top 1% teachers, some variation of it. But then she told this chilling story. She said, I had a boy, parents called me, and they said, look, we know that there's a special relationship between our son and you. He talks about you differently. He said, we're really having problems with our son. And we've decided to have a meeting this weekend. We would be very grateful if you would come and be part of the meeting because he values you so much. She said, okay, I'll do that. So she goes to the home and they have a meeting. The meeting would go pretty much like you and I would expect it to go. It was very conventional. She said, when the meeting was over, it was pretty unsatisfying. They didn't achieve much. And she said, the reason they didn't achieve much is they saw their son as a problem to be managed. And so the meeting didn't go anywhere. They lost to a fourth grader. She said, so in their house, they see him as a problem. In my classroom, I see him as fantastic. And I adore that boy. And he adores me. So I ask him to do things that are so far beyond his beliefs, things he knows he can't do. So link back to your poor first grader. Oh, it's going to be hard next year. That's what everybody's terrified of. But she's able to say to these 30 children she teaches, today we're going to do something that only seventh graders can do, and you're all in the fourth grade. Think how hard that is, but we're going to do that today. And she says, and they respond by doing it because they trust me. They adore me. I adore them. Potential's unfolding all the time. Now that teacher has broken a code. She's operating at a non-conventional level in terms of how she thinks, how she sees, how she operates. And she's accomplishing things that other teachers can't accomplish. Now, move that to the corporate boardroom. If I say to a CEO, do you adore your direct reports? 999 are going to say, get out of here. Right? They're going to be insulted by my question. But number 1,000 is going to say, yeah, I do. And when you go to that corporate boardroom, it's going to look very different. And so whether we're talking about parenting, school teaching, managing, it doesn't matter. There's a conventional mindset. It's universal across the earth. There's an unconventional mindset that produces excellence, and it works everywhere, even though everybody knows it can't. If you live in learned helplessness, you know it can't. Everything you experience teaches you that it can't. And if it could, that would be disastrous because you'd have to learn.
I mean, this is fascinating to me because especially since just yesterday I had a call with the CEO who has implemented a lot of the truly human leadership philosophies that Bob Chapman implemented at Barry Waymiller. He's good friends with Bob Chapman, and we were talking about layoffs, and he has a no layoff policy. Because just like Bob Chapman, he sees his people as someone's precious child. So your question about adoring your team, I'm pretty sure if I asked him that question yesterday, he would say 100%, I adore all my people. But that's not the norm, right? He was even telling me, he's like, I don't understand. If you get to a point where you have to lay your people off because you did not meet your numbers, you are the one should be held accountable for that. Instead, you're just getting rid of your people to make up for a mistake that you made for a poor business strategy. So it was a very interesting conversation. It also reminds me of a conversation I had recently with an organizational psychologist who has been deeply studying what is preventing millennials specifically, who are now very much in middle management, what is preventing them from getting promoted. And I really do think it's the conventional systems, conventional, control-based, fear-based leadership systems that have existed in the baby boomer, the Gen X, like that's just what corporate was, right? Millennials and Gen Z see things very differently. And so she's making it a point and making it her life's purpose to help the younger generations get into those roles. And so to prepare for our conversation together, I took her little quiz, her blind spot quiz. What are your blind spots? Because I'm a millennial. And so I was trying to put myself in the shoes of corporate Rebecca when I used to be in the corporate world. And I took the quiz. And my primary dominant blind spot was overvaluing purpose. And so I really wanted to talk to you about this one because you are so purpose driven. And the little blurb that I got, I'll just read it out loud, was you're deeply driven by meaning and mission, but this can make you less effective at translating passion into concrete outcomes. Executives are expected to connect big purpose with measurable results. Otherwise, you risk being seen as inspirational but not influential. So I would love your reflection on that because you argue that great leaders transcend the conventional problem solving. It's not that that they get rid of it altogether. It's still there, but they transcend it toward this purpose finding. So my question is, why does purpose feel so threatening inside most organizations to the point where it's preventing purpose-driven employees with leadership potential from getting promoted?
I want to go back to that notion of that you just illustrated so well in his caring about his people, right? In his particular company, which is the exception, not the rule. But we do find these people, and we find them sometimes in the most surprising places. When Jack Welch did his last book, that great big thick one, he did a book tour, and it was with PBS doing a coverage of it. So one of the places he came was to the Ross Business School. And so there was this session with him on TV, and several professors were asked to ask him 2 questions about his book that he would respond to. So when it was my turn, the first question I asked was, Jack, if someone accused you of loving the people at General Electric, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Now, he absolutely jumped into that question with both feet because he's a very enthusiastic guy, was. And he just talked for 5 minutes about how he believed the people at General Electric did, in fact, love him and that he loved them. And he gave lots of examples and so forth. I said, okay, well, my second question is, you've just written a very thick book with lots of techniques that you've invented that are very attractive. But never once in this thick book have you mentioned the word love. Why is that? Because could it be that these techniques that you've invented work because you love the people? And someone could go to another corporation, implement a technique, and it would be disastrous. Well, that really caught him off guard. And then he kind of recovered. He said some very useful things. But that illustration is really, first of all, here's Jack Welch. We think of him as the tough guy. He invented downsizing. He was tough. You couldn't find a more practical guy than Jack Welch. But Jack Welch, genuinely, he loved what he was doing and he loved people. General Electric has had a lot of struggles since Jack Welch. The strategy people would give you a lot of sophisticated analyses, but they would never mention that. And so the notion of really caring about people in an authentic way, not a transactional way, in fact, happens in the most extreme places where we don't even see it. Jack was doing it, but in writing this book, he never thought about making that clear and even seeing that that was key. That's a really interesting experience. Now, your second question is that you're really inspirational, but you may be seen as uninfluential because you're not practical. There's so many things to be said about that. One of them is, if we're truly inspirational, we could not be more practical. In fact, it's very hard to be inspirational without being practical. When that school teacher adores the children, she's giving them these challenges that are 7th grade challenges in the 4th grade. They should be panicked, but they're not, because she understands them. She understands the reality totally. To be an effective idealist is to be a realist. That is, I see reality. When if you go back to the opening question, I'm in that workshop, those people are afraid to go home and do anything on Monday. I have to start with reality. The reality is their fear. I have to feel their fear. I have to be with them in their fear. That's very practical. That's very grounded. That's reality. The average person doesn't see that reality, right? When a parent's struggling, when a CEO is struggling, they don't see the emotional reality. They just see a problem that's not them that they're going to solve. And so it's very hard to be inspirational if you're not practical. And inspiration is the most practical thing we have. In real leadership, we talk about inspirational motivation, and that is, I connect you to a future you deeply value. The person who's solving problems all day, who's living in learned helplessness, who sees the constraints and says, oh, I'm practical, is actually the blind person. It's putting them in learned helplessness. When you say to them, I understand you, I feel what you're feeling, tell me what you really want, and you make it possible for them to tell you, now they're articulating something outside of what is. And now if I nurture that and help them embrace that, then we are grabbing onto a new reality that they really want. That's purpose. The moment they have purpose, there's a path out of learned helplessness. Now we have to increase the passion. So, is there a danger? Yeah, I can become so passionate about my solution that I'm no longer practical because I've lost connection with the audience. Can I be so realistic that I'm ineffective? Yeah. I'm so realistic, I'm in learned helplessness. That's where the most people are trapped. But the interface, it's always about realism and idealism in a dynamic marriage. And so I want to know what's real. I want to know what's possible, and I want to open the path to possibility. And that requires me to be connected with you in a way that most people don't connect. Yeah. Why is purpose threatening then?
Yeah, I often felt like it was in my career.
Yeah. Purpose is threatening because it disturbs learned helplessness. If we clarify where it is you really want to go, the first natural reaction is, yes, but I can't go there. Your first grader is saying to you, the second grade is harder, and the fourth grade is going to be even harder. What he's saying is, I can't go there, right? You've now given me the vision, but I don't have the courage because what I see is my failures. I'm always focused on the deficit, not the possibility. Transformational change is about helping people take a new perspective where they see the possibility and they see how they can learn their way forward. So now I've moved you from anxiety to security, and I've moved you from low expectation to high expectation. So now we're in the flow state. When you're being challenged just beyond your ability, so you feel safe while being challenged, you go into flow. You go into optimal performance. You're doing your very best and you're learning from your very best. Now you're learning from excellence. When people, Csikszentmihalyi in his original book made a very crucial point. People who experience flow often are evolving. They're becoming something. What are they becoming? They're becoming autotelic. Auto means within. An automobile has the power within. Auto. Telic is purpose. I'm finding my purpose within. When you quit your job and started doing what you're doing now, that was a big, courageous decision. The purpose was coming from within. So what we're trying to do to each other is help each other become autotelic. We need lots of flow experiences. As we have them, we begin to say, this is the way life is supposed to work. When we do, we're no longer afraid of purpose. But when we're not when we're in learned helplessness, purpose is terrifying.
So I'm thinking back to the example you shared of, I can't remember who it was, someone in an organization who was literally just reacting to things and not connected to purpose at all and just kind of going through the motions. For someone who's in that state, or an organization that's collectively in that state, I really want to talk about collective empathy because I know that's near and dear to your heart and mine. And I think, we often think of empathy as the interpersonal empathizing, one on one, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. But how can leaders who are trying to get people collectively in that flow state and carry an entire team or organization through transformation when everyone is kind of scattered across different parts of the change readiness curve? How does collective empathy apply to that? And how can you help people move as a collective forward to that future state you're trying to drive everyone towards?
Yeah, that would require a book to answer, but I'll try to give you a short,
Let's write it.
a short shot at that. So let's assume you've got X number of people in some kind of collective, we'll call it an organization. They're performing at an expected level, which means they're average or mediocre. They're having problems every day, and you're spending your days solving problems. Then you're really not going anywhere. And that's where most managers are. They're preserving equilibrium. It's just natural. That's not a judgment or a criticism. It's just a fact. That's where human beings tend to go. That's the system preserving itself. If you're serious about pursuing excellence, then you as a leader are going to have to do a lot more work than you're doing right now. And it's not about other people, it's about you. If you start to do that work, you're, first of all, practicing individual empathy. you're looking at each of those people and you're saying, what are their deepest needs? What are their deepest interests? What are their emotions? What are their fears? When you had that conversation with your first grader, you discovered a core fear. And I responded saying, I had that when I was in first grade. So we're talking about a fear that's pretty common. And yet we make decisions about our children unaware of that fear, even though we had it when we were in first grade. So again, we're distorting reality. So this notion of empathy, which itself scares people, is a crucial skill. And so I begin to understand this person as deeply as I can, this person and then that person. One of the techniques for doing that is a listening tour, which unfortunately gets reduced to a technique, but it's me talking to every person in my stewardship. And it's me saying, I'm here to learn. Tell me about you. What's it like to have this job? What are your aspirations? What do you think the purpose of this system really is? Now, they're going to give, if they talk for 10 minutes, they'll give you 9 lousy answers. But they're going to give you one statement that's a jewel, a diamond. If you go to the next person, you'll get 9 lousy answers and a diamond. If you keep listening, you start collecting diamonds. Then you could go home at night and build a crown, put those diamonds together. You can begin to understand what the purpose of the organization or the collective is by listening to each individual. And what emerges is what I call the collective voice. Every organization has a voice it's never heard. What collective empathy is about is hearing the organizational voice. When you begin to hear it, you become a very different person. And when you hear that collective voice, you can now go back and say, what I'm hearing is a deep need for this and this and this. And as I look at our strengths, as I look what we're proud of, as I look what we're afraid of, it appears to me that our real purpose is not X, profit. It's not Y, that statement up, that PR statement up on the board. What we really care about is contributing to the human endeavor by doing this kind of work. If we create a great organization, the human endeavor is improved in the following ways. Now, if a person does that work correctly, the words they say become fire. The people are being heard in a way they've never been heard before. And they're hearing a message for which they're willing to sacrifice and spontaneously pursue the common good because there's value in our collective. Now they're willing to become individually more excellent and more collectively excellent. Now, there's 1,000 things that go with that. For example, you get their vision up, you get their courage up, you get them committed, and they try some little thing. It is crucial that you become a cheerleader. John tried this. It succeeded. What an incredible thing. Let's analyze that. Now, John tried this. It failed. What an incredible thing. John was trying to make it work. It failed. We normally, therefore, discount that. But just think what John was trying to do. Now, what could have been done differently so that excellence popped out of that? Let's learn from that. I just came from a place where a leader understands this and he does it. And he has these 14 principles that are so demanding. He expects you to give yourself to the customer in a deep way. Nobody would ask that. And there's 14 of those asks. And they're the operating principles. But the interesting thing is, every day there's a meeting for each cluster of employees. The ones that do X meet, the ones who do Y meet, and they take principle number 1 and they say, what happened yesterday in the last week or so in regards to this principle? When would one of us succeed at this? When did we fail at it? And they tell stories. And they say, okay, what do we learn from those stories? Now, as we go forward, what can we do better in terms of living this principle? Let's come up with some ideas here. Now, the boss is not in the meeting. They're holding that meeting. They're having that discussion every day. At the end of 14 days, they go back to principle number one. So in the course of the year, they're returning to these principles every day. They're having an authentic conversation at a peer level. Well, what's happening to that group? Something's happening to those people that happens in no organization or very few organizations. They're creating a culture of excellence. The average executive cannot conceive of such a thing, right? So collective empathy is the collectivization of empathy. In our very first session, I think I told you the story about that school teacher, again, from that same study, different school teacher, but she said, I made it a point to know the deepest needs and interests of every student. So she went the extra mile, violated the law of least effort. She went to their homes. She just extended herself to know her kids. And then once she did that, she said, I went to the next level. And I said, next level? What's that? She said, well, then I discovered that they're all the same. I said, you just told me every kid's unique. She said, they are. Every kid is unique, and they're all the same. Now that's beautiful. Every kid's unique, and they're all the same. Every kid wants to succeed, no matter what they say or do. Now catch that sentence. No matter what they say or do, every kid wants to succeed. They want to be respected. They want to be loved. When you break that code, then you can teach anybody, old, young, special ed, gifted, doesn't matter. So here's a school teacher saying, people tell you things that aren't true. My first grader says, blah, 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 blah. And I say, why? And then they say, blah, 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 blah. And I say, why? And then finally on the fifth one, they say, I'm afraid. And so people are doing that all the time. They're talking at a surface level that doesn't reflect that emotional reality. This teacher has made this discovery. And so she's got individual empathy, but she has empathy for the whole. She understands the collective, so she hears the organizational voice. She creates a classroom that's unlike any other classroom in the school. She produces excellence. So collective empathy is absolutely essential to genuine leadership. Now, again, leadership in my vocabulary is not holding a position, not being an authority figure. That's management. Anybody can practice leadership. The person at the bottom of the system or the top. It's a set of skills that are essential to life. In fact, it's almost unfortunate to use the word because it's so corrupted, so tied to the notion of hierarchy. But it's basically learning and influence. Are you a system of learning and influence? Continuous learning, continuous influence. Are you a living system? Conventional theory is turning you into an object, not a living system.
I love that analogy because I see organizations, teams, schools, families, whatever the system is, right? We're a living organism. We're not just an inanimate object or a function just going through life, right?
Hold that image for just a second, because you just stated something so essential. The conventional mind, all the assumptions of economics and all the other social sciences say that you're an object. I have self-interest, scarce resources. I have to manipulate you to get what I want. That's the essence of conventional theory. We all live it. Sounds awful when I say it, but we're all doing it all the time. It's our default option. And when we transcend ego and fear, and we begin to learn about the things we're talking about, we begin to create systems that are living systems. One of the big changes in life is when we see the dynamic whole. In all the religions, they have models where at the top of the model, people suddenly see the oneness of life. They become whole. They see that everything's a unity. And that's a universal experience. It's rare, but it's universal. And they're seeing the dynamic whole. When you and I have these little moments, we get glimpses of the dynamic whole. Our job in the end is to see and nurture the dynamic whole. That's not what most managers think their job is.
I love that because I'm thinking of another part of your book, Lift, where I think it was towards the end when you had a bunch of students give feedback on your course, and you had a Buddhist tell you, I realized this is leadership is actually Buddhism. And then you had a Jewish person tell you, actually, so you had all these different religions, basically, these students of different religious beliefs come to you and say, oh, this is actually my religion. And, I grew up Presbyterian. And then I became agnostic. I studied Buddhism for a while. So I'm not really like I don't follow a specific path, but I consider myself a spiritual person. And when I read your work and when you talk about this, I get it. Like I can see this the transcending kind of spiritual nature of how people can connect at a higher level and then connect it back to spirituality. So that's a completely different podcast episode, completely different topic, but it's fascinating to me because it's yeah, once you realize that we are all a living system that is a living organism, we're all connected to each other. We're connected to nature, we're connected to our neighbors, we're connected to everything. Once you realize that, I feel like there's so much more you can accomplish as a collective. So that said, I mean, just to wrap up our conversation, if there's one thing that the leader, a parent, a teacher, whoever, whatever the context is, someone who's struggling in the conventional system and doesn't know how to break out of it and start to transcend it a little bit, what is one thing they could do today to start down that path? One small step.
There are many answers to that. Just give two simple ones. One is to ask this question: what result do I want to create? Turns out answering that question is, people say, oh, I'm a very busy professional. I ask that question all the time. No, that's not the question we ask. The question we ask all the time is, how do I get what I want? Oh, here's a problem here. The problem's dreadful. I want to solve the problem because I want the dread to go away. What result do I want to create is a future that doesn't exist, that's better than the present situation. What result do I, when it comes to me, I create? When it comes to my first grader, what result do I want to create? Comes to my family, what result do I want to create? The higher I can conceptualize that, the closer I come to having a real purpose, because it's not about individual results, a basic stance for me to be in life. So what result do I want to create? Number two is be still, ask the question and be still. Listen to the internal quiet voices. Now we know there's an ego. We know there's a conscience. Conscience is almost always inviting us to do something good and inconvenient. Ego is always inviting us to preserve our energy and survive. There's always a war inside between those two things. And so I think the simplest answer I could give this morning is ask deeply, what result do I want to create? Two, be still. Listen, not to the ego, but to the conscience. And don't be afraid of what it's inviting you to do on an experiment.
I love those tips. And it's interesting because with my Buddhist studies, be still is pretty much everything I learned. If there's one thing that I learned from meditating was learn how to sit in your own discomfort for long periods of time. And I can recall when I was a kid, I bought a Christian music album by the Newsboys, and there was one song, was mid-90s when it came out. There was one song in there called Be Still, and it was all about, be still, know he is God. It comes from a Bible verse, but you can see where all the spiritual traditions connect to this, transcending ego and just being.
Yeah, I think if you look across the 5 world religions, which is a very good thing to do, this is 3,000 years of wisdom and therefore value. And if you look across those 3 and you ask the question, not how they're different, but how are they the same, then a model emerges. My friend Mark Krieger and his colleagues have written about this extensively, but when I boil his very sophisticated model down to the essence, there are 5 levels. Each level The bottom levels cannot access the top levels. So the bottom level is logic, making sense of what is in the material world. We all have to do that and should do that, must do that. The next level up is emotion. What is possible? Not emotion, imagination. So I'm going from what is to what is possible. The third level up is motivational system. And that is you have ego and conscience, and ego transcendence or second birth in whatever religion it is the transcendence of ego in some period of time. When you do that for the first time, now you can have experiences that are driven by conscience rather than ego. That means you're in contribution and you're getting better. You can learn from excellence. That's creating a more meaningful life. So that fourth level is experience and learning from excellence. The fifth level is totally transformational. They call it the non-dual level. What that means is logic disappears, emotion disappears, experience disappears. You, in that highest state of contemplation, whether it's Buddhism or Christianity, is you enter that state of dynamic oneness. Everything's connected and everything's good. The primary force in the universe is benevolent. You then come out of that state and you return to logic and you return to imagination, but you're going through cycles. The more often you do that, the more you develop. Now, I think that's incredibly beautiful because that's universal across all five world's largest religions. There's something absolutely essential about that. If I turn to science and the theories of development and the research around it, I can give you the same model. And so there's something really, really central for us to think about. And we should be a little careful about dismissing religions or dismissing science.
Yeah. No, I love that because you ended this episode on a message that we're all more similar or where we have more in common than we think. So we're often trying to categorize ourselves like they're this religion, they're this political they're well, we put people in boxes and then we say, oh, they're the other. But actually, as a collective, we have much more in common than we think. And I think as leaders, as humans, as parents, whatever our role is in life, if we take that perspective and ask the question, what result do you want to create? And be still a little bit more often, I think that's already a really great place to start. So thank you for this super insightful dialogue and oh, what a wonderful way to start the day.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, my friend. I really appreciate being with you.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And if you would like to learn more about the Empathy Collective, check out our website, theempathycollective.com. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.